Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership podcast hosted by Alison Humphries. The Recruitment Leadership podcast is here to help those in the recruitment industry gain awareness and understanding on the hot topics faced by those in the business of hiring people. In each episode, Alison Humphries is joined by a fellow expert to offer professional knowledge, insight and advice on the biggest subjects affecting recruitment businesses. It's the podcast to listen to for recruitment business frontrunners seeking expert information from industry-leading advisors. Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. I'm Alison Humphries, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Barry Cullen, who is the managing partner and founder of Rec Law. Clues kind of in the name. But for those of you who haven't either met Barry or heard him speaking at conferences, which I've seen several times, I'm sure this is going to be fascinating. And I would also urge you to stay tuned because Barry's going to break some news from Rec Law and a special offer. So hang on in there. Now, Barry, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. You were actually a recruiter before you were a lawyer. That is a fairly unusual career path by anybody's standards.
Yeah,
Talk us
I like
through
that.
how you came to start and what made you think that the recruitment world needed its own dedicated firm.
I love that. The first question, open up with, where did you fail previously, Barry? I was going to be an engineer. That was the plan. That was the life plan. I was going to be an engineer. I was going to be building telecom systems, etc. And it turns out my maths was nowhere near good enough to be a proper engineer. So I dropped out of university. A lot of people do. I did school, started uni, dropped out, and then a friend of mine said, "Oh, I've got a job photocopying over in this office in America Square in the east of the city. I can get you a job here till you figure out what you want to do." And then little did I know I was going to be literally photocopying CVs and stuffing them into envelopes for Huxley Associates back in the days before mail shots being done by email. So mail shots, a lot of us will remember, were literally done in the post. And that was my first job in recruitment. And then before you know it, I gave probably either the wrong or the right person, I'm not sure which, a little bit of lip on a particular day. And they liked the way I argued, so they chucked me on the sales floor as a resourcer. And then went from there, resourcer, 360 recruiter, ultimately ran my own agency, legal agency, for a very short time, before realizing that I wasn't really very good at it. I struggled through. I tried my best. I sort of rode the .com bubble. There's an aging anchoring point for you. Rode the .com bubble, then rode the year 2K testing bubble. My specialism changed overnight. And then ultimately, when the year 2K came around and planes didn't fall out of the skies and computers didn't generally break, I realized that it was the markets that had carried me, and it was time to go and get what my mum calls a proper job. Went off at that point to become a lawyer, which came again from giving somebody a little bit of lip in a bar in central London, and I realised that actually I could argue pretty well. And they said you should go off and become a lawyer, and I took them literally. And then went off and went to university. That the second time around, finished it, and then qualified as a lawyer.
Wow.
So that's the failure story that led to it.
So that must give you a pretty unique insight amongst lawyers into what is real for recruiters, because we often know what should happen in theory and legally, but actually market pressures and it's a very relationship orientated profession, recruitment, and therefore understanding how those play out with the law, I think is probably a view that you've got uniquely. So what made you think that the recruitment industry, at least in the UK, needed a dedicated legal firm?
The market sort of drove it. I wasn't planning, when I went to become a lawyer, I wasn't planning to become a recruitment lawyer from the outset. No, I was just planning on becoming a solicitor. And then when I started work, all my friends and connections were recruiters, and therefore those are the phone calls I received. And like any good recruiter, I spotted a market, spotted something that I could specialize in, and therefore decided that that was the direction to go. After being a general practice lawyer for a number of years, but with a really large amount of my work being in that recruitment space. I was doing a lot of restrictive covenant work, so enforcing and helping people get out of restraints, as well as doing fee dispute work. I'm a litigator at heart, so I deal with disputes all the time. And that market carried, and the business got busier and busier, eventually started hiring people. And much like recruitment, where people fall into recruitment, I fell into being a recruitment specialist lawyer. And then after a long while, realized that is actually a really, really good niche. And as you say, the law is the law. Not a lot of that changes whether you're running a recruitment company, an estate agency, or any other business. There's not a huge amount of differences. But that commercial specialism and that really understanding your niche and having that niche sort of a mile deep, and an inch wide is hugely valuable to clients in the recruitment space. And that's why we then drove to that.
Yeah. Okay. So you are literally an advert for the importance of niche markets and really specialising.
Yeah,
Now,
definitely.
Rec Law, your firm, is well known for fee disputes. You were always introduced, I think, as Backdoor Barry.
Yeah, whether you like it or not, that's the introduction.
Yes. Which makes you sound rather seedy, I think, but never mind.
Yeah.
But what else does Rec Law cover?
We're a specialist firm within the recruitment space. So there's 4 core things that we do. We do litigation, what modern lawyers would call dispute resolution. So dealing with disputes ultimately. A lot of that is fee disputes, recruiters not being paid by their clients, whether it's backdoors, rebate disputes, fee level disputes, whatever it might be. Also simple outright debt recovery. So we do a lot of that work. Then we get into the areas of, contractor and worker disputes. We'll have scenarios where end client decides to bin off worker at short or no notice, and then of course the blowback goes onto the recruiter generally. So we get involved to help resolve those disputes. Disputes within people's businesses, shareholder boardroom disputes, any sort of dispute within the recruitment space is what we do within the dispute litigation team. But then we also have an employment team who do all the lovely stuff. So they draft employment contracts, draft staff handbooks and policies, and all that lovely stuff that helps people grow their businesses. But they're also there when things get difficult. So disciplinaries, grievances, employment tribunals, enforcing post-employment restraints. So we do all of that work within the employment space. And then finally, we have a commercial team. So the commercial team are generally reviewing and improving recruiters' terms of business or drafting them from scratch. And then also supporting recruiters when they're receiving sets of terms from their clients.
Right, which is increasingly the case, I think, isn't it?
Hugely, yeah, hugely.
And it does worry me. Quite a lot of the businesses that I work with and have worked with feel that they have literally no choice but to accept these things in toto, and part of that is because they see a contract and they just go, it's legal, I don't understand. But what worries me is when they agree them without realizing that their client has in effect lumped huge liabilities on them, and that also, and this is very frequent, I think, also that the client's terms are generic. They're for any form of supplier. And so lots of the peculiarities of recruitment supply just aren't covered in there, like transfer fees, for example. If under the agency workers regs, we have to increase somebody's pay, there's nothing ensuring that the client
no provision to allow a mechanism for increase of that side. And they are often generic procurement terms for the procurement of goods and services. That's the sort of thing you see, or consultancy documents. And then there's sometimes a potential interplay between the terms you're signing up to and your insurance. Because if you're agreeing to terms which don't describe the work you do, there's then a question mark as to whether any of your insurance policies are going to cover you for the work that you're actually providing, because it's not, on the face of it, it's not recruitment services.
Yes, that's a really good point. So we'll talk some more about what has changed over your long career. It'd be very interesting to hear what things you think have changed. What are you seeing more of? What are you seeing less of than before? For example, I think recruitment businesses are much more willing to defend their terms and claim fees in a dispute than they were, say, 10 years ago. Is that your experience as well, Barry?
Yeah, I'd say so. There's a few factors in play. I think the recruitment industry has grown up a bit in the last 10, 15 years. It's become more confident in itself, and it's been more confident in, I have provided a service, I should get paid for the service. So there's a bit of that in it. I think there's also quite a lot of education that's happened within the industry over that period. So, recruiters are starting to understand their rights a bit more, as well as feeling more confident in the value they're bringing to their clients and to those partnerships. I think so. There's a lot of that. There's also a major economic, more macro impact. When times are tight and there's fewer clients hiring, recruiters will often be more reticent to pursue a client for a fee, because they're worried that if they lose that client, they're not going to have any other clients. So there's always that concern. When times are tight and there's less recruiting going on, that's more likely to be the view taken by recruiters. Whereas when in candidate dry markets, or when we're in economic boom times, where if not this client, then it's the next one, then there can be a little bit more confidence in, well, actually, we'll stand our ground, because it doesn't matter to some degree. We'd like to keep the client, but we only want to keep the client if it's on an equal footing, if we're equal partners within the relationship. And if we feel like we're being rolled over by a client, then that's not an equal partnership and an equal value to the relationship. So we might as well get ourselves paid and moved on to somebody that will value what we do.
So I think you made a very interesting point about there has been a lot of education going on, sort of peer-to-peer, and also from suppliers to recruiters. They've made information much more accessible, really, haven't they, by doing webinars and podcasts like this and so forth. What else do you think? What other types of cases are you seeing more of and less of than, say, 10 years ago?
Well, we've been seeing a lot more rebate disputes recently, rebate and free replacement disputes, naturally, because of the economy. Clients are offloading new employees more than they would have done even as recently as the sort of COVID point in time, particularly that tech space. So there's a lot more disputes around rebates. There's a lot more disputes around penalty clauses. A lot of recruiters will draft their terms in such a way that they'll say, we'll work at 20%. But if you don't do X, if you don't pay on time, we'll charge you 40%. And on the face of it, that's a penalty clause, and the courts won't enforce it. So there's then a disagreement between recruiter and client at that point, which is where we then often have to come in and resolve matters. Or little things like a recruiter will, their standard charge will be 25%. They'll agree to 15. They'll put 15 in their terms. And then when the client doesn't pay on time, the recruiter will say, oh, well, I'm defaulting back to my standard terms now, even though there's no provision in the contract, in their own terms of business, to allow them to do it. And therefore there's disputes. So those sorts of rebate disputes are pretty common at the moment. You mentioned transfer fees. They're becoming much more contentious. There is a significant lack of understanding within even recruiters as to how transfer fees work, and the fact that there is actually a statutory regime that sets out when you're allowed to charge them and when you're not allowed to charge them. So a lot of recruiters don't have that properly put in their terms. And if it's not properly put in their terms, those transfer fee provisions become unenforceable as a matter of law. Now, 15 years ago, 10 years ago even, maybe even 7, 8 years ago, most end clients didn't understand that there was that statutory regime. And therefore, they would simply look at the contract and say, oh, the contract says I must pay a fee, therefore I must pay a fee. But now the end clients, their lawyers and judges are becoming much more switched on to understanding that bit of the law. And again, I think that's part of the consequence of these sorts of webinars and podcasts and the sharing of knowledge within the space. People are becoming much more informed, and the sort of growth of talent, internal talent as well, means that knowledge from the industry is coming into the end clients as well. So there's a lot of that. So I'd say that's obviously a lot of backdoor hires, multi-agency type disputes, but I would say specifically those transfer fees and rebates are quite a big issue at the moment.
Yeah. So you're referring here to the rules for workers, i.e. PAYE temps under the conduct regs, where there's a window in which we can charge a transfer fee. And I think that's a really good point, actually, because so many recruiters are putting their entire temporary workforce through umbrellas. They've kind of distanced themselves from all of this, and they may not be aware that just because we're using an umbrella doesn't mean that they're outside IR35.
Yeah.
Okay, but some interesting changes there, and some points, as you say, which are to do with market forces. But I do think it's a really positive thing that more and more recruiters are getting educated about the law, and they're getting an opportunity to educate their clients. I've certainly worked with firms who have taken that in a package, if you like, to clients, for example, around IR35 or changes to holiday pay, those kind of things. And the clients have been very pleased. It pitches the recruiter as a knowledgeable professional partner, much more than
the consultant part of recruitment consultant.
Exactly.
The often maligned and missed part of the job, right? The
Yes.
consultancy part of the job. In fact, to speak to what you've just said as an example of that, when the public sector rule changes came in, so in relation to IR35, the most recent changes before the jump over to private sector, which we all remember was never going to happen, right? But of course did happen. But when it was first public sector, I have a number of clients who massively increased their runner numbers during that process because they got informed, they got educated, they got ready so early that they were the first people coming to their public sector clients saying, this is coming down the line, this is a thing that you need to be aware of, let's come in and educate you on it, explain where your risks are, explain what you need to do to protect yourself from those risks. And they actually got to the point, a number of them, where the public sector clients were saying, well, actually, we've got 300 temps on our books, 100 of those are direct. They're directly on our books. We manage them. We don't have an agency involved. That sounds like a lot of risk that we're going to take on and we don't really want it. Can we agree some sort of package where we transfer all of those over onto your books? So because of a regulatory change and because the recruiters got ahead of it and understood it and took the time to go to their clients and consult them on it, they were picking up tens and tens and tens of contractors onto their books. Granted, often at a payroll type rate rather than a full supply rate, but nonetheless, it's more revenue.
It's all revenue. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think
and then you've got jobs for replacements as well when it comes about.
That's a really nice illustration of a point that every time we talk about the law, I do notice that there are some recruitment business owners rolling their eyes. For example, I do quite a lot of work with my clients on their policies and staff handbook.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of people approach this as it's a box ticking exercise. It's a chore. And to be honest, I've seen quite a lot of off-the-shelf staff handbooks provided by HR consultancies and some lawyers in cases, which are that. Their policies just say, our policy is to abide by the law. They're doing nothing for you. And actually, there's usually an opportunity in something if you approach it the right way. So you talked there about IR35, instead of being, oh God, what a drag and a limiter on our work, approaching it up front as an opportunity gives a completely different outcome. And the same, in my experience, applies to really well-crafted staff policy. But let's just go back to the core business of claiming fees. What I'd like to do is to sort of work backwards, if possible, in a preventative way for our listeners. So I wonder if you could outline along the process what you think are the most common mistakes that recruiters make, which are likely to jeopardize the fee at the end of it. Is that possible?
It usually starts with the terms. So it usually starts with inadequate terms, poorly drafted terms. We've all done it. We start a business, we've got a choice between spending £2,500 on something to go and build revenue or money to buy a new set of terms of business. And we think to ourselves, well, where can we nick a copy? Can we get it off someone's website? Can I nick my old bosses? What can I take away from somewhere else? And these days, can AI do it for me? Can I get large language models to draft me a set of terms? There's all these cost saving mechanisms which make huge amounts of sense. But the problem becomes you don't know the quality of what you've got. Just because your boss had them, just because your competitor has them, it doesn't mean they're actually any good. And we see a lot of what's the technical legal term? We see a lot of dross terms of business out there, which in themselves cause a really big problem. So making sure you've got those solid terms in place. The next area, which normally is a problem, is, and I'm sorry to say, it's the humans. The humans normally mess up a good process and a good procedure. You can have some beautiful terms of business, wonderful processes, and then your consultant just goes off piste and doesn't send the terms, as an example. Oh, I've known her for years. I didn't need to send my terms of business. If I had £1 for every time someone said that to me at the beginning of a first consultation, I wouldn't be working anymore, because the amount of times it's a good friend or a good contact or whatever it is, and therefore I never sent my terms, and now I want to enforce my terms. How do I do that? If they've never even seen them or been put on notice of them, how do I do it? Please educate me. How I enforce a set of terms that the other person never even seen or been told about. Yeah. So humans often mess things up at the outset.
Can I just cut in there, Barry, before you continue on your sort of prevention chain?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on the great many businesses, recruitment businesses, that now agree a set of terms with one manager in a client, which is signed at the time for a number of business units, possibly within that client, and they're still relying on them 3 years and 50 placements later? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I got a few thoughts, right? It's good law. So long as that manager was authorised or ostensibly appeared to be authorised to sign, it's good law. If it's a decent contract, it's well enough written as a framework type arrangement, and it's signed, I have no problem with enforcing that contract 3, 4, 5, 6 years later. It may be even longer. We've seen contracts that were signed 12, 13, 14 years before, and they still form the bedrock of the relationship. So as a matter of law, I don't have a major problem with it. Commercially, I have more of a challenge with it, more of an issue with it, because the likelihood is you negotiated some preferential rates for them at some point, or you negotiated something on the basis of what the relationship was going to be. And then 3, 4, 5 years later, that relationship might have changed. You might have been working at, God forbid, 15% in order, because there was this massive recruitment project. And then that massive recruitment project finishes within 18 months. And you're now, if you're lucky, doing a spot deal once a year with them, but you're still doing it at those massively preferential rates, even though they're no longer a good client. So I think it's the commercial aspect. What I normally recommend when somebody agrees, improved terms for a particular client, is that ideally you would have your standard terms document, and then you would have a letter of variation, or a separate document say, here's what we've agreed to change. So we're going to give you preferential rates, we're going to give you longer payment terms, we're going to do whatever we're going to do, here's what they are, but then time limit it. So these amendments, these variations will apply for the next 12 months, or the next 6 months, or the next X amount of placements, whatever it might be. So that, because what we'll often give you an anecdote of what happens. You're not quite alluding to this, but it's sort of on point. Consultant, recruiter, agrees terms with hiring manager at client, does a placement with them, or doesn't, who knows. Right? 5 years later, 6 years later, nobody's spoken to this client since. That recruiter's left the business, never to be seen again. And somebody else now does a deal with that client, introduces the CV, runs the recruitment process, wonderful placement, sends out the invoice at 25% on remuneration, for this, 200 grand position. And then when the bill doesn't get paid, there's an email back saying, "Oh, really sorry, do you not remember we agreed 12% on base salary 5 years ago? Here's a copy of the contract." So now, instead of getting 25% on 200 grand for the total rem, you're getting 12% on 80, 90, 95, whatever the actual base salary aspect of the package might be. And that's but that's less about a contract than about good contract management. It's a bit like handbooks and policies. You were talking about them being, some people see them as being box ticking exercises. Contracts can have the same problem. People will often sign terms, chuck them in a drawer. I know we don't physically do that anymore. Please chuck them in an email archive somewhere. Chuck them in a drawer and forget about them. But they're a living document. They're meant to guide what you're meant to do and how you're meant to work, particularly if you're on client-side terms. Because client-side terms, you need to understand what you've agreed to and make sure that the services you're providing are being provided in accordance with it. Now, if you sign a contract that says an introduction means the delivery of a CV on the back of a goat on a full moon on a Tuesday, and you don't do that, then you haven't made an introduction. If you're
Yes.
sitting more realistically, it's going to be a portal upload, right? CVs must all go to HR, CVs must all go to talent, CVs must all be uploaded onto a portal in relation to a specific job reference. If you're not doing that, then you've not fulfilled your part of the contract, and therefore you're making my job harder and my team's harder when your client takes a candidate off you without paying a fee. So understanding those contracts are living documents, and actually keep understanding what you need to do and how you need to operate with particular clients.
Yes, that's a really good point. I got involved with advising a recruitment business leader who had exactly what you describe, a long-standing relationship with a particular manager in a business. And terms were agreed, and they were a couple of years old. But the relationship was so intimate, professionally, that what she'd started doing was, in order to show speed of response, if she went out to market and headhunted a candidate who was interested, and she always had spoken to the candidate, she was sending the client just a link to their LinkedIn profile. And of course, the inevitable happened. Client manager gets replaced by another client manager who then refuses to pay bills because he had understood that she was effectively just being helpful rather than making an introduction. So there's loads of things there, but if I can just take you back to so you made a really interesting point about having your standard terms and a letter of variation, which is time limited. And I'd just like to add to that the importance of keeping terms of business in one place, ideally with a revision date or a review date, that whether or not the clients impose terms on you that say they go on indefinitely, it makes a lot of sense to actually have even an annual review with your client, and to make sure that, as you say, the service hasn't changed, the key personnel haven't changed, and the process hasn't changed.
And also that you're still, if the contract's 2 years old, you need to make a decision when you're doing that review. If I was being offered this contract today, would I sign it? Because
Absolutely.
if you wouldn't sign it, if you offered to stay, then why are you staying in it?
Yeah.
A lot of terms will have non-solicitation, non-dealing type provisions, client-side terms. You will not, anyone that works in our business, you will not provide recruitment services to them.
Yes, exactly.
You sign up those terms.
Oh, and even
3 years
and
later,
you will tell us.
and you've not done any business with them. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you've signed this, you've done no business with them for 3 years. Then you place someone that works for them who applies to one of your jobs, publicly listed advert, all perfectly reasonable. You've not gone hunting them out. Nobody remembered.
Yes.
Because nobody bothered looking back at the terms. So
and I've seen
important.
multi-million pound trade sales of recruitment businesses fall through because of this kind of thing, because one of their most important clients had imposed some really risky terms on us that we just hadn't spotted. So for the audience, quick message: do stay tuned, please, because Barry's got some news that's coming at the end of this podcast and a special offer. But let's return now to your prevention chain. So you've covered the terms, the people, the recruiter who goes off-piste, as it were. What else would you cite as a critical path point?
I would say if we stick with the people a little bit longer, because it's the sending the terms out, making sure you're not scared of the terms and you're agreeing the terms at the front end, but then also knowing how to deal with hiccups along the road and how to deal with disputes along the road. So a good example would be, you send the terms over, you get a job spec off a hiring manager, you send over some CVs, you arrange some interviews. You'll have deeming provisions within your terms. So by interviewing your candidate, they are deemed to have accepted your terms. Then the hiring manager gets to the point where they want to offer someone a job, and they go, oh, actually, I need to get HR involved now, or I need to get procurement involved now. And then we've all had that phone call. HR, who are you? You're not one of our preferred suppliers. Or procurement come in and say, well, we need to agree terms. And the biggest problem we have at that point is the human sales instinct, because a human sales instinct is to grease the wheels of the process.
Yes.
So you want to agree with the human on the other side because you want to start that relationship and that conversation well. So, Billy for the sake of giving our recruiter a name, Billy might say, oh yes, of course, who do I need to agree terms with? Or who do I need to negotiate with? Or of course, we're willing to negotiate. Which from a sales perspective makes perfect sense. Here's an obstacle, I need to overcome the obstacle, let's deal with it. But the problem then becomes, if that attempt at negotiation fails, and at the end of it, HR say, no, we're not going to work with you. If we now go to front of a judge to argue the case out, we're going to say they accepted our terms by interviewing our candidates, therefore our contract applies. But the lawyers on the other side are going to go, no, clearly, even your client didn't think there was a contract at that point in time, because otherwise, why are they offering to negotiate? Why are they asking who they need to agree terms with? If they're talking in that language of who do I need to agree, then clearly they didn't think there was a binding contract at that point in time. Whereas if your people are trained well enough to spot that, deal with that, and use what I call the two most valuable letters in the recruitment world, which is RE, re, if they can deploy that in the same sales environment, they'll protect themselves. Because imagine the same scenario, hiring manager has interviewed your candidates, therefore accepted terms, HR or procurement get involved and say, we don't know who you are, we're not on a preferred supplier list. If your response is, of course, I'm very happy to have a conversation with you, we can revisit our agreement, we can renegotiate the terms of supply, we can look at that. It's still the same sales greasing the wheel, moving the relationship forward, but the default position now is, if that renegotiation fails, then the default then isn't no agreement, the default is the contract that was already in place because the hiring manager had interviewed your candidates.
Right.
And in front of a judge, that story sells. Because it's clear that the recruiter thought there was an agreement at that point in time, and they were offering to renegotiate or revisit the terms of supply. So
Okay.
massively valuable
That
letters.
is an absolute pearl, Barry. Thank you. I'm sure listeners will take that one to heart, because it's so easy to do.
I had a case where we recovered, I think it was about £135,000 for a tech recruiter, almost exactly the same scenario. There was a number of contractors who were taken on directly after this process, but thankfully our client, who I know very well, when they realized there was a problem, when HR got involved, they came to me and said, what do I do now? And I emphasized this renegotiate piece and said, look, what draft emails for you to send, so say, look, we're happy to have it as a renegotiation, blah, blah, blah. So they went through that process, it failed, HR said, well, we're going to hire them anyway. And we got introduced shortly after that, and pretty quickly were able to persuade the lawyers that actually they'd really boo-booed, and they ended up paying over about £135,000. Imagine getting £135,000 of revenue off a client without actually having to supply the contractors. You could then take the contractors and move them somewhere else. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's a great story. Thank you. So organize your terms, review them regularly, renegotiate, and
train your people. Basically.
Lots of re's here, aren't there? And remember, if somebody throws in a query about terms, once the process has started, it's a revisit, renegotiate. Okay. I think there's another point there, isn't there, which is just one that bothers me slightly. Obviously, recruiters do a lot of their business now on their own devices, on their mobile phones. And very often that's where the terms and any variation to terms and the proof of the introduction all sit. And they end up, even on WhatsApp increasingly, which is really...
We see a lot of that.
And I would just give a shout out to all business owners who are listening to make sure that every time we invoice for a placement, all of that data is uploaded to the CRM. And if necessary, don't pay any commission until that happens, because you are leaving a vulnerable business.
In the cycling world, I used to be a keen cyclist, less so now because I've got bored of being knocked off my bike by cars. But in the cycling world, there's a turn of phrase which says, if it's not on Strava, it didn't happen. And much the same attitude within recruitment. If it's not on the system, it didn't happen. So I know a lot of businesses out there who will either simply not pay commission until it's all up there, or they will uplift the commission, to reward good behaviour rather than just punishing bad behaviour. So if the CV send out, if the terms, if the interviews, if everything's been booked through the system, we'll uplift your commission or your P&L value on that deal by 10%. something along those lines, and I've seen that done really well. It really drives positive behaviours rather than necessarily just punishing bad. The problem with trying to punish bad is a lot of recruiters will go, well, I can go and do this somewhere else.
Yes.
I go, and I don't need the hassle. And they won't make me do it, so I'll go do it for them instead. Whereas if there's the uplift, you're trying to drive that positive culture, right? The good behaviours, rather than necessarily purely just trying to crush the other ones.
All really valuable points. Thanks. So just following along that chain, if I can we can just circle back to that.
Yep. So knowing how to deal with the dispute stroke credit control. Far too often we have clients that think credit control starts on day 15. So the invoice is overdue, credit control kicks in. Credit control should be starting much earlier in the process. So at the point where the deal is being agreed, even. So as part of that deal process, who do we need to speak to about any POs? Who do we need to speak to make sure we're onboarded as a supplier? Careful not to say to agree terms, but onboarded as a supplier. What do we need to do to make it your job easier, Mrs. Hiring Manager? What do we need to do so that all of this paperwork and admin happens without you needing to worry about it? So getting that process done really early on. Ideally, being pretty clear with the client as to what the fees are. So when this deal is done, this is the amount our fee will be. Pre-placement, pre-invoice, so there's no concerns or doubts. And then likewise, when the invoice is raised and sent out, get it sent out as early as you can. If your terms are on acceptance, raise the invoice on acceptance. If it's on start date, get it raised on the start date. Get it out right at the beginning of the process, but then get someone to put a call in. Have you got the invoice? Great. Is there anything else we need to do? No. Brilliant. And make sure you're dealing with any of those potential hiccups in the road right at the start. And then in the week where the invoice is due to be paid, another quick call in. Are we on the pay run? Is it all going to plan? Do you expect any problems? So you're covering it all off as you go along. So that then you're more likely to get paid on time. But if you don't, then you're in deploying the provisions within your terms. So conditional fee rebates, conditional fee discounts. You should have both of those in your terms. Because then your credit control can be speaking to the hiring manager or to accounts payable at the client and saying, hey, look, that £15,000 invoice was based on a 15% discounted fee. Because you've not paid on time, you now owe the 25%, which is £25,000. We don't want to trigger that. Can you just get this invoice paid today? Or get it paid in the next 48 hours, and then I will make sure we honour the discount. You're using the contract to your benefit. You're giving that person a real reason to want to pay, and you look like the good guy, right? Because you're saying, I want to keep that in place. I want to keep your rebate in place. You've got to give them real reasons to pay.
And similarly, a call on start date, if your terms say that's when you can bill, otherwise they lose their rebate. A polite call to the client, just saying, look, I don't want you to lose this. I am the nice guy. On that day, almost invariably gets them to go down to the finance department and give them a kick to pay.
And a nice trick you can deploy. Look, a lot of this trick will depend on your finance system. There may be some VAT implications, depending on whether your cash or accruals VAT. So it's something to talk to your operations about, something to talk to your either internal account or external advisors if you don't have tax advisors in-house. But it's showing your discount on your invoice. So that £25,000 fee, it would be the first line of the invoice, placement of Jane blogs, £100,000 salary, 25%, £25,000 fee. And the next line on the invoice, timely payment discount, minus £10,000. Because what you've got to remember is when your email arrives with your client with a CV attached, that email gets forwarded on either to accounts payable, if you're lucky, or it gets forwarded on to an automated system that strips the invoice off and puts it onto an accounts payable system. The person in accounts payable, the person that actually pushes the buttons to make the payment, they don't see your contract. They don't generally see the emails. They generally see nothing other than the invoice. And if they're staring at a screen with 100 invoices to pay, and money might be tight, they might be told, look, buy us some time here and there, see what you can do about delaying payment. If there's 100 invoices and 99 of them say, £15,000, and the 100th one, your one, says £15,000 if you pay within the next 7 days, otherwise it goes back up to 25. Guess which one of the 100 gets paid first?
Yes, a very good point. Well made. Thank you. And there is definitely, in my experience, an increase in late payment from clients at the moment. The moment, just for listeners' benefit, the moment being spring, summer 2024, because this will be going out for decades afterwards. There's definitely an increase, and I haven't seen so much of it since the 2008 crash. Obviously, things were really serious then. So before I move on to the next question, any other important points in the prevention chain that you want to highlight?
Well, I would talk about payment plans a little bit briefly, because money is tight. Some businesses want to pay, they just don't have the money. So identifying a client that you would categorize as a good client and categorize as a client that's likely to survive and they're only paying because of cash flow problems. Be open to putting payment plans in place. Yeah, and if you're open to putting payment plans in place, make sure you document them clearly. If you go onto my LinkedIn profile, I've got a free advice note on how to negotiate and structure payment plans for recruiters. So it makes it really clear what's being agreed, what the fee is, what the exact payment dates and times are, what happens if they default on the payment plan. All of those bits, which often aren't done very well by people. So just structuring them and documenting them well is a really important thing. And then the final bit is recognize that resolution of a dispute is the same as a sales process. Yeah. So in a sales process, you have to identify objections, overcome the objections, and then you close the deal. In dispute resolution, we have to identify the objections, overcome the objections, and then we get a resolution. It's the same thing. A lot of it, the law obviously has a lot of complications, but so does recruitment, but it's very similar. So what we see a lot of is, recruiter sees candidate ends up out hiring a client they introduced them to, picks up the phone to the candidate, says, "Can't believe you've done that to me. I worked so hard for you, and now you've done this, and I'm not getting paid." And then bangs an email over to their client with an invoice saying, "If this isn't paid immediately, I'm going to sue you." It's like, can you just go in and actually find out what happened first? Put a call in to the candidate. Absolutely delighted you ended up working at that company. I knew it was the one for you when I put you forward back in whatever. Yeah, absolutely delighted for you. Really well done. How did it come about? Because then the candidate in that situation is possibly going to say, "Oh, well, actually, it's funny you should ask, because you put my CV forward and then 2 days later that director phoned me up. Now you know you've been cut out." Yeah. Or it might be, "Oh, yeah, no, I remember, but about 9 months later, another recruiter got in touch and told me about this other job in another office." So you know what you're dealing with, because they're going to be much more open to sharing information with you and potentially becoming your ambassador and going to bat for you within the client. And likewise, client side, it's not straight for the jugular. It's not 2 feet knee height stud showing. It's a slightly more slower, not slower. It doesn't have to be slower, but it's a more considered approach.
Yes, a more rational approach. I think that there's yet another example of the importance of recording calls, because the situation that you described, that's going to be evidence if it should come to a court case, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. But even in the absence of that, a follow-up email is always really good. You'll notice lawyers always do this. Whenever we talk to a client to give them some advice on the phone, we then send them an email shortly afterwards confirming the advice that we gave, because we want to make sure there's an audit trail showing what we said and what was agreed. So doing the same, you can be following up that candidate. Lovely to talk to you. Delighted you got that job. Really well done. Best of luck for the future. Thanks for explaining that. Blah blah blah. Yeah, you've got a documented email. If what you put in the email isn't true or doesn't match their recollection, the human nature of them will be to reply, "Actually, that wasn't quite what happened. This is what happened." Yeah. So that follow-up email can be useful from an evidential perspective as well.
Okay, thank you. And Barry, you mentioned a free guide on payment plans that is on your LinkedIn profile as well. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries.
There are occasions when the dispute is not legal. It's not really a legal one. It's more just a sort of, no, I'm not paying your bill. See what you want to do about it. When, in your view, is a lawyer the best solution for a recruiter, and when is it actually a job for a debt collector?
They fulfill similar functions. They fulfill similar functions. So a lot of it will come down to a commercial decision.
Mhm.
Generally, lawyers are going to be more expensive than debt collectors. Generally, that's not always the case. But if it's a simple debt matter, you're going to be thinking more about the level of service you can get from your lawyer or debt collector, and the commercial terms that are available. So
Mhm.
I would say it's less about debt collector versus lawyer, and it's more about speed of service, quality of service, and cost of service. So if you can get a lawyer working at a decent price, then they're fulfilling a similar function, and therefore it works really well. And not all lawyers and not all debt collectors are the same. So a lot of this is quite a broad brush sort of commentary. But in my experience, a lot of the debt collection market is much more workflow driven. It's because it's got to be low cost. It requires less human influence and less human decision making, and it's more if this then that. Send this letter, wait that amount of days, send a text message, make a phone call. So there's a really driven process, rather than within legal, which is typically more the disputed environment, or where there are issues in the case, and that's much more bespoke. It's much more like, in this case, what do we want to do? What's our best strategy? How are we going to recover in the quickest time at the least cost with the least risk? And it's a much more typically, and not always, but typically it's a much more considered case-specific approach, as opposed to debt collection, which is typically, and again, broad brush, typically much more workflow driven.
Right. Okay. So if a client is not denying that we made the introduction and that there were terms in place, they're just choosing to ignore them, does it make sense to go to a debt collector over that rather than a lawyer? That's a question.
It can do. It can do. What I'm trying carefully not to do is to suggest that debt collectors aren't good, because there's some absolutely excellent debt collectors out there. And I'm not trying to suggest that lawyers are always better. It comes down to a number of things. It's perception from the other side sometimes. So some people will recognize a Dunning-based debt recovery process, and therefore they'll go, oh, it's that one, right? So I know now if I wait 7 days and ignore it, I'll get this, and if I wait, I'll get that. So they're educated in the process, and therefore they know how long they can ignore it for before it becomes a real threat that they need to engage with. Generally speaking, if it's a lawyer with a lawyer's letterhead on a letter, it feels much more urgent, and it feels much more like, okay, I can't really drag this out. I've got to engage with it quickly.
Right.
I think more important really is getting the terms right, getting the consequences of the failure to pay on time right. So the discounts falling away, rebates falling away, to give you the power to really recover your money as quickly as possible. And then whether you're working with a debt collector or a lawyer, it's then the strategy. So in this case, what is the best strategy? Would it be a friendly approach? Because often that works. In fact, here's an anecdote for you. We had a case where our client had been trying to get paid for 9 months. It was an £18,000 fee, including VAT to 15, really 15 plus VAT, and they couldn't get it paid for hell or high water. And eventually they came to us. We saw that, look, it's not actually, although you've been chasing it for ages, it's not massively aggressive. There's still quite a friendly conversation going on. So we'll get involved, but we'll do it in quite a friendly way. We offered a call to the head of HR that was involved. She was very happy to pick up the phone. So it was me that happened to have a chat with her on that occasion. And while we were talking, she said, look, if I'm honest, I'm really embarrassed by this situation. Your client did the work. Your client should have been paid for the work, but our CEO has his nose put out because a previous candidate they placed dropped out a day after rebate, and he feels, why am I now having to pay all this additional money when I didn't really get much value from the last one? Whereas I, the HR person, understand it, and I get it, and I understand why you've got to be paid this new fee. But and the problem is, I can't sign off an invoice at this level. And I just picked up on that. Dispute resolution, objection handling, right? Here's the issue. The CEO's the problem. Then she's given me a little bit of, I can't sign off an invoice at that level. So my response, of course, was, well, what level of invoice can you sign off? I can sign off up to £10,000. I said, well, so if I was to get you 2 invoices for £9,000 each, you could sign those off, couldn't you? And she thought about it for a moment and went, yes, I could do that. Would you do me a favor and just put them a week apart so it's not as obvious when they look at the accounts? I said, yeah, not a problem at all. So just to take
Brilliant.
that slightly friendly approach, seeing what the issue is, identifying where the objection can be overcome, you get it done really quickly. Whereas if I'd gone in, really aggressive, she'd have had no choice but to lawyer up or to go external or whatever it is, and therefore we'd have had a much longer fight. Yeah. Whereas it's about, as I say, quickest possible recovery with the least risk and the least cost.
Yeah.
And I feel sometimes debt recovery doesn't really get to that. It's because it's often a process. It doesn't identify, oh, in this situation, we should do this thing, as opposed to here's another debt, here's the process we follow.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting story. Thank you. So, Barry, you mentioned earlier in the conversation an important distinction, I think, between punitive clauses in terms of business and discount. Can you just explain that again for our listeners, please?
Yeah, sure. So the civil courts in England and Wales, their purpose is to put the parties to a dispute back into the position they would have been in had the dispute not happened. So if everybody had done what they were meant to do, what would the outcome be? That is what the courts are designed to do. They are not designed to penalise one or other party to a case.
Okay.
And therefore, there's a doctrine which is a prohibition against what we call penalty clauses. Yeah. So if you have a contract, for example, which says we charge 15% on remuneration as our introduction fee, but if you don't pay on time, we will charge you £1 million. Yeah. That is a penalty clause. It's very clearly a penalty clause on its face. Yeah. So the court will say, no, we're not going to charge, we're not going to enforce the £1 million, but we potentially will still let you have your 15%. Yep. So that is a penalty scenario. It's an extreme example. Obviously, more typical would be we charge 15%. If you don't pay on time, we'll charge you 40%. That would still have the same feeling of a penalty clause. Whereas, if you had a contract that said, our standard fee is 25%, we will discount that for you to 15%, subject to the following conditions. And then you list a number of conditions, telling us you're interviewing our candidates, telling us you're offering a candidate, telling us you've engaged a candidate, paying our bill on time. These are what we call conditions precedent. So conditions that must be met for the discount to apply.
Got it. Right.
If the conditions aren't met, the discount falls away. Therefore, you charge your standard fee, which is the 25%. So it's the same outcome. You're still getting to the point where you're charging the higher amount, but in a contractually enforceable way.
The wording is absolutely critical. Right. I'm sure there'll be a lot of listeners scurrying away to have a look at their terms now. Okay. One last question before we come on to your news. One of the things that I've had some success with in the past is asking, as a routine thing, asking candidates at the point of discussing an opportunity with them, asking them to confirm in writing, just by sending them a very standard sentence, if you like, and getting them to send it back, that they are giving us the right to represent them. This is particularly useful where you're in competition with a lot of other recruiters, and there can be arguments. And my rationale for it is that the conduct regulations do say that we have a duty to make sure that any candidate's details we submit are that candidate is willing to work in that job. Now, nevertheless, of course, there are recruitment businesses who do not speak to the candidate first. They rush a CV off to the client to try and get in there first. And unfortunately, they very often do seem to come out on top when there's a dispute about who's owed the money. Do you have a view on those right to represents?
I think they're brilliant. I think they're really good. They're really powerful. They're really helpful. If I'm standing in front of a judge, I would much rather be arguing the case of, I sent this, I got the permission for the candidate, here's the proof. I made the introduction, here's the proof. I ran the interview process, here's the proof. So the more of that you've got, the easier it is for me to sell that story to a judge. So I think it's a really powerful thing. There's one slight warning with it. It doesn't have to be an email from the candidate to you. So you could be, we were talking about follow-up emails earlier. You could be confirming something that they've done verbally.
Right.
So you could be saying, lovely to talk to you earlier today. Thank you so much for giving me your right to represent you to the following clients. And then maybe there's a list of clients, or to the following categories of clients, consultancies within the London region, tech businesses within Glasgow, whatever it might be, the scope of your search parameter, if it's not a specific job. Because it happens infrequently, but it does happen, where we've had cases in the past where, particularly post GDPR, people were really concerned about consent. Rightly so, privacy by design is massively important, but they were hugely concerned by this piece. And because they were hugely concerned, they had this really structured, concrete process of you must get the right to represent email from your candidate before you're allowed to introduce them to your client.
Yes.
And the problem we had on a few occasions was recruiter would speak to candidate. During that, would obviously explain who the client was.
Yes.
Then they would say, could you please get me your latest CV and send me a right to represent email? I'll send it to you in a moment. You just need to reply and confirm. They've finished the call. They've sent the email. At that point, the candidate's gone, I know Joe. Joe works there. I don't need this recruiter anymore. Hasn't sent the CV back, hasn't sent the right to represent email back, has contacted their contact at the client, and then been interviewed and hired. Now, on the face of it, that recruiter has caused that engagement to take place. And therefore, on the face of it, you would think they should get paid. But then if we think back to the contract,
I see.
The engagement must be usually following an introduction. And if the recruiter's not made the introduction, the consequence is there can be no fee for that engagement. And we've had cases like that in the past. So what I prefer to see is an email from recruiter to candidate with a really good right to represent email, but just saying, thank you for confirming this.
Got it.
And then as quickly as possible, getting that introduction made, even if you're only saying, look, I'm waiting for their current CV, their name is this, they work here, whatever it is. So you've made that introduction. Because an introduction doesn't always have to be a CV. If the terms are drafted well enough, it will be providing the CV or any information concerning a candidate. That sort of broader thing. So you talked about a LinkedIn profile earlier. Of course, we prefer to send a CV, but if you haven't got it, you want to make the introduction. You want to make it as early as possible. And therefore, in those scenarios, LinkedIn profiles, snapshots, candidate summaries, names and where they work, that sort of stuff can be invaluable in these scenarios.
Yeah, gosh, thank you. There have been so many really valuable and actionable points here for listeners. Now, but to finish, you are developing now a new product, Rec Protect. What does it do, and how can listeners find out more?
Sure. So Rec Protect is an out-of-the-box legal function for recruiters. Simple as that. So it's aimed typically at recruiters that aren't necessarily quite big enough to have their own legal function internally yet. So it's a subscription model. It's platform-based. And for a monthly subscription, you get access to our legal documents. So best-in-class terms of business, and that roadmap is developing. We will be going into corporate, we will go into employment, we'll be going into tendering documents, all of that side of things. Then, in addition to the best legal documents you can get, there is a training program. So we will train your salespeople. It's a 6-week program. We will train them on how to do their job in such a way that you get paid. We're not teaching them how to sell. That's what recruiters do. They know how to do it. They know how to train that. We teach them all the stuff we know about how to deal with approaching the market, agreeing terms, representing candidates, dealing with disputes. Some of the stuff which I'll give you some snapshots of today is a really thorough, in-depth training program, which just puts recruiters on steroids and makes sure they're really, really even better at what they do. And in addition to that, legal clinics. There's 2 drop-in sessions a week where you can come in and ask any of the legal questions that might impact your business and get one of our lawyers to answer you there and then. So it's not, oh, we've got this problem, we need to go and instruct a lawyer, we need to spend more money. You just come to the clinic, ask your question and get your answer. So a lot of our clients are feeling that really positively on that. We had one that recovered a $9,000 fee off a 5-minute chat with us instead of having to then instruct someone. So that's absolutely brilliant as well. We've also got unlimited debt recovery letters. We're talking about debt recovery versus lawyers. Some lawyers do both. So within our portal, you can access unlimited amount of debt recovery letters. And then the final piece is backdoor detection. So we have developed the software to identify when your clients have actually taken candidates through the back door, so lost fees, and then we can report those back to you so that you can make a decision on how to decide whether to go and get your money off your client or not.
Marvelous.
So
okay.
It's that
now,
whole
I am
package
100%
ecosystem.
certain that there's going to be listeners who want some of that. How should they contact you? And do we want to give them something to quote from hearing on it on this podcast?
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Yes, they can either visit recprotect.net do not go to recprotect.com unless you want insurance for your Winnebago in Canada, because that's what they do. We're recprotect.net, or find me on LinkedIn. Either of those work. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm pretty vocal on there. And if they want to get involved, we recently closed our beta program on it. The beta program is giving 40% discounts on the license fees. If you quote Alison's name when you get in touch, then we will honour that 40% rebate for June. So for the month of,
that's a fantastic offer.
I'd say the rest of May and June. If it comes through quoting Alison's name, we will continue to honour that. We're not giving it to anybody else anymore.
Okay, great. Well, thank you on behalf of the listeners. Barry, brilliant guest. Thank you so much for giving us your time. And you can find Barry Cullen of Rec Law on LinkedIn. And I'm Alison Humphries, that's the name you need to quote to him, of Recruitment Leadership. And if these or any other topics surrounding your compliance, your chances of getting paid and making yourself more profitable, things you'd like to discuss with me, you can reach me on alison@recruitmentleadership.co.uk. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, review and share so that others can find the podcast too. We really appreciate your support. If you have any questions about the topics covered or wish to find out more about recruitment leadership, please email alison@recruitmentleadership.co.uk referencing the podcast. We're also on LinkedIn, where you can follow Recruitment Leadership and connect with Alison Humphries. Thank you for listening, and we hope you join us next time for another episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.